So today's guest and I shared a 1-year educational experience, and we both went into that potentially, maybe not consciously, but at least with the goal of learning to have these good conversations and do this kind of thing. And when that awesome experiential thing inspired me to make this podcast, I thought, well, obviously it makes sense to have Joshua Parker as my first guest. Joshua, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben. I'm glad I could be here to talk with you.
So one thing that we talked about, all sorts of things. We talked about AI. We talked about theology. We talked about all sorts of these political issues from a more philosophical perspective. But we have not really shared our beliefs on education, despite the fact that we were together doing education together.
Yeah, and despite that, we're both pretty passionate about it.
We are. And we are also both still forming our opinions about this.
Yep, that's another great similarity that Ben and I have is we love to sort of hold our opinions from being 100% on one side until we're 100% sure.
Exactly. And I think that allows us to teach oh my gosh. That allows us to teach each other stuff. Through question asking and through looking for logical consistency and looking at why we believe what we do and all those things. So, Joshua, to start it off, what has your educational experience been throughout your life?
So for me, I was public school, you could say that. I guess it was technically a charter until seventh grade. And then I switched to homeschooling from that point till I graduated from high school. And since that point, I have done a 1 year program that Ben already mentioned.
Awesome. And it's my understanding that through homeschool you were doing classical education?
Yes, it was a program called Classical Conversations, very much focused on getting that classical education.
Yeah. So, what did you like about those things, and what did you not like about those things? And having a wide range of different experiences, what is it like to be able to compare those?
Yeah. So, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about homeschooling, and I think that for most kids it's actually such a great thing, is because I didn't have the best experience with the public schools when I was younger. Part of it was that I was bullied, as a lot of kids are in the public school system, but also I think that the way it's framed is really almost depressing and is very ill suited to meet individual kids' needs. I was very ahead in some subjects from some of my classmates, and so I wasn't really learning in that situation. And so when I switched to homeschooling, I really loved how I was able to read a lot of great books and grow in my knowledge in that way, improve my speaking skills, which is something that's applicable to everything, and really be moving at a pace that would be good for me.
hmm Yeah, I can say that when I take a look at homeschooling, I definitely view that individualized learning as the most obvious strength and something that I would imagine most people can get behind. And I know, just looking at me and my siblings and then other homeschool families in my community, I definitely see how parents can teach each kid in a way that is designed for them and for the way that they like to learn, because part of God's design for reality, or if you're coming from an evolutionary perspective, part of the fact that we all have different DNA is that we're all different, massively different.
Yeah.
And we don't understand how we get different in all these things and what all these influences are in our life. But different people learn different ways and excel in different areas and have different styles of ingesting and remembering information and different styles of understanding and synthesizing information. So I think homeschooling makes a lot of sense for that reason. Um,
Agreed.
and I'm still in the process of doing historical research into why do we do education the way we do? Why is the public school system the way it is? And I don't have the answers to all those questions, but um, I do want to talk about those things a little bit. Um, but one thing that you'll hear a lot, and that I think is maybe that you won't hear a lot, but if you're researching these things like me, and that you'll hear a lot, is that the education system came to be this uniform thing with bells and sitting at desks and looking at a teacher and watching them write on a chalkboard and being in school for 12 hours a day or whatever it is. That pretty much came to be during the Industrial Revolution, when kids were, probably going to end up being part of a uniform system of production for 12 hours a day with rigid rules and bells that ring and obeying a set of instructions and being tested on their performance. And none of those things about society are true anymore. Yet here we are left with an education system that is the same thing in that regard.
Yeah, it's fascinating how in some areas our society is so quick to throw off the past, but in others it subconsciously just clings to it.
Yeah, very true. And because humans are flawed, the things we cling to aren't necessarily the things that we ought to cling to, and the things we let go aren't necessarily the things we ought to let go.
Yeah.
Um, but I have a very interesting idea, and I think you have heard this before. I think it's a helpful tool for conceptualizing the I think it's a helpful tool for analyzing the philosophy of education. And that is essentially that there's 3 presumptions that affect how we think about education and how we go into the way we craft these systems. And the first one, in no particular order, is that what is the state of the occupational world? What is the future going to be for this child? And one is, what is the state of the informational world? What are the things that this child has access to know? What are the things they need to have memorized? What are the things that they're going to be basing decisions off of? What are the things that they won't know if we don't teach them, right? And then you have, what is the actual nature of a child in the first place? And I've already talked about one aspect of what I believe the nature of the child is, which is that we're all different.
Yeah. And it's the first thing that pops into my mind is nowadays one of the things that actually plagues many people our age and when they're approaching careers and coming out of the educational system or like at least finishing it up is that the information available is pretty much infinite through the internet. And the occupational opportunities are also pretty much infinite. Obviously, there's different barriers of entry to different positions, but you can pursue, especially in America, you can pursue those different job opportunities.
Exactly. And that is really, really, really different from the way that things were when the public school system was invented.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And obviously those things are very different than when classical education was invented as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, so my entire experience with classical education is the 1 year program we did, which I loved everything about it. And obviously, classical education is not a uniform thing where every system is exactly the same, but it is generally conceptualized by educators as having a certain set of characteristics and following a set trajectory.
Hmm.
And I don't know the history of how that came to be. Um,
I know
Other
just
than that,
a little bit about the history of classical education if you'd want me to go into it in
go
slight
ahead.
detail. So, officially, it was like first created or developed in Greek society and when they were first creating the first academies. And it was basically a way where they could grow in knowledge through discussing and studying classical work, which was actually at that time just beginning to be created, or at least what we would consider classical work. And throughout time, as you hit the Dark Ages, as they're called, a lot of that disappeared, and it only reappeared when we hit the Renaissance and the medieval era, when the church started reintroducing the classics into society, started studying from them, and scholasticism was invented or brought about in that method of study, and that reintroduced the study of the classics, right? And discussing the classics, growing in knowledge from the classics. And nowadays, I don't have a perfect definition of it or even near enough knowledge about it as I want to have, but it's basically, from my knowledge, studying a lot of the classical basics for life. I think generally it focuses more on the liberal arts, studying classical literature, and also just discussing in Socratic dialogue.
Mm, yeah, and that definitely lines up with my big picture view of Western civilization and everything, and how the Middle Ages were, the Dark Ages, right? Like a lot of that stuff kind of went into remission as you had feudalism and the church taking power and all those things. Um, yeah, it sounds like in Greek culture, I believe my understanding is that private tutoring
Mm,
from professional tutors for specifically kids in aristocracy was the system of education at that time. Like that's kind of the environment that was created in.
I could see that. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly, but it was either that. I know that definitely came before the academies, but I think the academies definitely
Right,
played a part.
right. So, and the academies were like higher levels of learning,
Hmm.
right? Am I
Yep.
correct? Like we both read Plato's Republic, where uh, Socrates is like this teacher who's having philosophical question based debates with his students. Um, and that's kind of where my conceptualization of how Greek culture works come from, or at least the only document from that time that I've read.
So I'm
Um,
curious to think, do you think classical education is the solution to the problem that faces our public school system today? Or do you even think there is a problem? Because it sounds like you think there's a problem, but I just want to clear things up.
there is definitely a whole host of intermingled problems, and they are all rooted in problems with us as humans and problems in the cultures that we create. And there's only so much you can do to fix those things. Um, However, just because the fact that we can't have a perfect education doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue a better one, right? And I don't think that classical education is necessarily an end all be all solution by any means, right?
Agreed.
And my experience with classical education, or the first experience with it that I had, was actually a rather negative one, where I spent 1 year in classical conversations, and a lot of the problems with that were just functions of the culture at that particular co-op. But there were elements of it as part of classical conversations that I wasn't the biggest fan of as a child. I was probably 6 or 7, like first grade or kindergarten, and you would sit down in class and they would teach you a bunch of information. The teacher would be like presenting information that you need to remember. And it would be something like, these are the 4 types of bodily tissue or whatever. And I would raise my hand and go, well, what are the 4 types of bodily tissue? She'd be like, and then she'd pull out like gift bag wrapping paper of different colors with like text on it that says the kinds, and she'll say each one, and then you'll go, wait, so you're saying there's confetti paper tissues in my body? Like, she's like, no, there's not. These are just things in your body. And I'm like, well, what are they? Like, besides their names, what are they? And she's like, you don't need to know that yet. And that's how it was with everything, right? Like, we would have to memorize a 6,000-year timeline of human events without being taught what any of those events were. Just a name and a date, or a date range. And I was going back to how each child is unique, as the unique individual that I was and am, is that I can't remember anything until I can understand and synthesize it. And it was all very frustrating for me for those reasons, to be like forced to say, you must remember this stuff, and what it means you don't get to know until 6 years from now.
Yeah. That sounds really frustrating. It seems like actually a flaw in the system.
I would think so. And how it's answering that presumption of what is the nature of a child, I don't entirely disagree with. I just think they're missing out on another aspect, right? So they're saying a child is this little sponge that is capable of soaking up all this information.
Right.
But they're missing out on the fact that every child is different, and how that sponge soaks up that information is different. And for many children, my former self included, that water gets into that sponge through understanding the meaning and the story and like the implications and an analysis of answering the question why and how.
Right. It's sort of, I mean, this might be a stupid analogy, but it's sort of using that sponge thought process. It's like if we imagine a full understanding of a concept being all the colors of a rainbow, and when what they were doing was essentially putting in the base white to like even make it possible to add all the other colors of the rainbow, so to speak, all the other aspects of that concept, right? But you needed to understand what that rainbow is going to look like before you could accept that like base layer into yourself.
Yes, that is an excellent analogy. I love that. But with the program we were a part of, I loved the way they did classical education in that stage of the process, right? Because they're teaching essentially we're young adults, right?
Yeah.
And
Not essentially, we are.
we are. Not everyone considers us that, but we are. And um we could have a whole nother episode ranting about how our society views human age development and all this stuff. But
Yes, we could.
um but at that program, it was all based around Socratic discussion, which I would imagine is why they have us read Plato's Republic first.
Hmm.
Um and through that medium, it is all about understanding and comprehension and applying and fitting it into a larger worldview and looking at it through the right epistemological lenses and accessing all those layers of the information beyond just this is what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg. I mean, that wasn't in what we learned, but you get the point. Um,
They actually were specifically against that, which I appreciated. Um, it just bothers me when I'm learning information for no applicable reason. That's one thing that bothers me. I could still do it, but it just feels like a waste of time.
right, right. And, algebra feels like that to me.
Yeah.
Um,
I think though there's a difference between there being a frustration with learning something that we're not skilled at and learning something that feels unnecessary.
right. That is, or even, wait. Oh, I thought you were going to say a thing and then you said a slightly different thing. Can you say that again?
Yeah, no problem. Just that I think there is a difference between being frustrated at learning something we're not skilled at and learning something we feel is unnecessary.
And a third thing as well,
Okay.
learning information that means nothing.
Hmm. Such
But
as.
yes, I love that distinction. Or, well, information that the meaning isn't brought with it. I'm talking about classical education.
Okay.
I'm talking about, so, anyway,
I'm just
for
curious though. Like
listeners,
I don't know what you mean by words that mean nothing necessarily. I just want to clear that up before we move on.
oh, sorry. So, I'm talking about, like, when you're 6 years old and you're told the Civil War ended in 1864, you're wondering, what is the Civil War? How long
Hmm.
ago is 1864?
Okay. That makes sense. So what you mean by that is words that have no meaning because the application or the relevance isn't included in the
Exactly,
learning process.
exactly.
Okay.
And that's what the early stages of classical education do, or at least that's what CC does.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you.
Um, but you started CC after that memorization stuff phase?
Most definitely I did, and I'm thankful for that.
Okay. Exactly. So we're learning a little bit of something here.
Yeah, so what were you going to say though to the listeners?
Oh. Gosh, now I'm forgetting the Wait, what was the context?
You were just saying the three things.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Wait, I was going to say something about the three things. The three
Yeah,
presumptions.
yeah, yeah. No, not three presumptions. Just the things about information, learning, it being some being
Oh, yeah.
hard to learn,
I was just
unnecessary, and meaningless.
Yeah, yeah. I was just going to say those are all very different reasons, but very common reasons why a child or a young adult or an adolescent will not want to learn the thing you're teaching them.
Yeah, very true. And like one key example of this is um, when we look at how much of the population wants to read, for example, in their free time. And at least my experience has been that a large part of the population, because of schooling, has been disincentivized to read because it was such a painful process for them in school.
Yes, yes. I have seen that in my friends, I've seen that in people online. Definitely a huge problem, right?
Hmm.
Because for pretty much everything except math, reading's the best way to teach yourself a thing.
Story is the best way to teach yourself a thing, in my opinion, which is totally different tangent. But
Well, that's something. It could be argued that that's just Ben and Joshua's temperaments, that they really like story.
oh, I could go into it. We could go down this path if you want. I think it's applicable to everything. But
Yeah. I don't know. My mom figured out pretty quick that story was the way to teach me anything, right?
mm,
Like, the way she chose to teach my siblings and I history in grade school was primarily reading historical fiction books.
mm,
Then we were asking questions about the broader historical context, and she does her research and answers them. But primarily the fact that we're seeing a character living life in those circumstances makes it tangible.
right, right.
And that's something that's way more resonant with a young child and will make them want to learn history, right?
Yeah, and I'm gonna, if if I may, I want to expand it as like it's the best learning way for stories, the best learning way for all ages, humans. I think that story is the
Mm,
best way. Like what I think about is looking back in my past, and I think if you look back in your past, if the listeners look back in their past, they think about their most formative learning experiences. It's either from one of two things. I think that it's either from a story they've experienced or a story they've lived out.
mm,
And by that second thing, I just mean an experience you've had where
right.
you're living out your own story. Everyone's living out their own story. And a lot of times, I would argue, a lot of people would say their own experience is the best learning for them. And I would argue hearing other people's stories, even fiction, or other people's experiences, even fictional people's experiences, is the most impactful way to be changed, to learn, to grow, and also to be changed in a negative way. And I think that's why it's so important that story is the focus because it's so powerful.
Mm. I agree with that. I think it's really powerful. But say you have a child that's an absolute math prodigy
Okay.
and they don't even like watching movies, they don't like reading fiction. Are they learning math through a story?
Hmm. The question I would ask is why are they learning math?
Well, they're a part of an institution that says, here, learn math. And they start doing it. They find that their brain excels at it relative to their fellow children in their grade. And they love solving a problem and getting an answer.
Hmm. Is that not a story in and of itself? Think about it. It's a journey. It's a quest. It's a quest to find an answer to a problem that faces you. I'm
There
not
we
completely
go.
sure about this theory. It's just a theory at this point. I'm not going to make the absolute statement of, or maybe I already have, but I'll rescind that absolute statement. I don't think I have enough basis to make the absolute statement that story is the only best way to learn. But I think that if we look at examples like that, we find that story is even prevalent there.
Yeah. It sounds like if we're defining story as broadly as we are, then you're, in my view, undoubtedly right.
Okay. How would you just say we're defining story right now?
I think story is this fundamental part of how humans understand the world,
Hmm.
and it can take on a lot of different forms in how it looks, but it usually involves some sort of conflict and resolution,
Hmm.
some sort of understanding of an order that things either occur in, or uh, things that lead from one thing to another, you know?
Hmm.
Like in the math example, there's this conflict, which is we have a problem, which is we don't know what x is.
Yeah.
And then you do a set of steps. Like when you're physically writing algebra, you write a slightly more simplified version of the equation under that, a slightly more simplified version of the equation under that, a slightly more simplified version of the equation under that. That's a set of steps in an order to overcome a problem
Hmm.
and get to a resolution.
Right.
And we do that same thing when we look at any one event in our lives, or when we look at our entire life, or when we look at a historical era, or when we look at how am I going to clean my room.
Hmm. Yeah. It's interesting because if we define story too broadly, does it lose its meaning?
It could, I think, um, but we have a framework for it, and we have these things, right? Like some people, when they think of story, they think of specifically the hero's journey.
Right.
And I think that's an excellent example of how story impacts us, and a particular set of things that we really like as humans.
Hmm.
And it looks to me like that transcends culture a little bit. To some, that might just be a modern Western invention, but
Oh, I think that the hero's journey, we can see it even as far back in any society.
yeah.
Look at
I
the
mean,
myths, right? Even Russian myths. I mean, um, Native American myths follow sort of that journey of conflict and resolution. A hero, right?
yeah. Yeah, yeah. When I say the hero's journey, I'm talking about a particular set of 12 steps. I wish I knew them by memory, but I don't.
I know some of them. It's basically like you have the hero starting out in the journey, then he gets the
You
call
have,
to adventure, and he has to
yeah,
overcome the
well, before
adversary.
the call to adventure, you have the inciting incident,
Right,
and then you have some sort of conflict. The first conflict is, will I accept the call to adventure?
right.
And
And
then they
then,
do, right?
usually.
Ben, or like Luke Skywalker,
Hmm.
meets Ben Kenobi before he goes and gets on the Millennium Falcon and rides off to the Death Star, right? Um,
He actually accepts the call to adventure before then, right? He accepts the call to adventure when he travels with him to Tatooine. Or to the major city on Tatooine.
true, true. Um, but like when we're talking about movies, we can get really, really specific in how we define story.
Hmm.
There's something called the Save the Cat beat sheet.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I don't know how many it is, but it's like maybe around 50 something steps
Right.
that pretty much every movie has, right? A Greek play
It
didn't
could be
have those
argued.
steps.
It could be argued, but I would disagree with that actually. But
Oh yes, there are exceptions. There are. Every movie is, and I'm sure the book that depicts that explains that there's exceptions. I haven't read it yet, um but those 52 steps are a lot different than a Greek tragedy
mm,
or a Shakespearean tragedy.
but they're all connected
But
through story.
they're all connected through story, right? So, um and you and I as Christians, I think, believe that the ultimate meaning of reality is a story,
Mm-hmm. I mean
and
that's
that
yeah,
God inspired a work for us to understand that grand story,
yeah,
you know?
and I think that goes back
And
to like the learning aspect of it, right?
yeah,
Like, what's the most formative learning experience that both you and I have experienced? It's the learning experience that Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world and the Savior of you and me when we couldn't save ourselves. We were faced with the problem of not being able to save ourselves from eternal death. And you have the grand sacrifice and story of how God saved us as people, right? And
and
that's changed our life.
you have a final resolution in Christ coming back and uniting heaven and earth and all that. And it's like even an atheist can't deny that that is really beautiful
Yeah.
and that stories are really beautiful.
Mm. Yeah.
And my theological understanding of that is that the fact that we are made in God's image, I think part of what that means is that he gave us story.
Yeah. And
I mean,
expound on that.
yeah, I mean, when we look at just Genesis 1:27, in the beginning, God, oh whatever, that's Genesis 1:1.
Mm-hmm.
um, and God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at that, we see in that passage the character of God being represented by the fact that he's a creator.
Mm.
And there's stories to the very act of creation. And the thing you create is a story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we are creators, just like how he's a creator. Not
Mm-hmm.
just like, because we're not all powerful. Um, but he's created reality as a grand story, and he's created us to have this intrinsic desire to understand it that way.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So how does that apply to, like, just bringing it all back? How does that apply to the thought of changing the learning system for the better, or developing, or in our own thought process, even how we learn?
Right, right. I think, um, I think a lot of educational philosophy today is looking at education as teaching someone facts to memorize. You know, I think the early stages of classical education does that, as we've identified.
Hmm.
And I think public or charter or private school as a system will usually do that.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, I would presume, comes from a desire to be a little bit more objective in your teaching, right? Because when you don't have interpretation,
Right.
it's theoretically easier to teach things that all of the parents of the students are going to agree with.
Right.
And I
But
would argue that recently they've kind of thrown that out the window, but
but it's interesting how story, even kids can interpret stories, right?
yeah,
Like we look at this and kids can tell the meaning of a story sometimes better than adults can.
yeah,
And I
subconsciously even.
right, it's a subconscious human skill. And so yeah. Hmm. It's a big thought.
It is. Like, um, what I've seen in case the listeners can't tell at this point, Ben has a very good uh, memory of his childhood.
And Joshua here does not have as good a
Yeah,
memory of his childhood.
yeah. Um, but part of that memory is I do kind of remember certain things about my parents' parenting that I can interpret now, and I think, yeah, anytime I learned anything was through a story. In that, like, say you're being taught a moral lesson, one of the ways we did that in my household is through those Old Testament stories
Hmm.
and the stories in the Gospels. And another way you do that is when a life event happens, like conflict between siblings, just the very act of, oh, now there's a conflict between siblings, now the parent has to come in and say what's fair and say what's kind and say what's loving and do punishment if necessary. That's a conflict and a resolution.
Hmm.
That's a set of steps. That's a story.
Yeah. So how does that apply to us today?
I think when we look at the fact that we have this education system that has this whole host of problems that we haven't even really considered, or when I say we, I mean the society. Um, we have things like the problem of bullying that you identified. We have things like um, some kids wanting to learn at a faster pace or just being able to learn certain things at a faster pace and others learning things at a slower pace, but because you're all in a class together, it's all uniform. You're not able to learn whatever, right? And we identified in classical education how trying to teach information devoid of story is often quite ineffective. And I obviously you and I think, oh, the solution is just to homeschool.
Hmm.
But not everyone can do that.
Right. It's not realistic.
It's not a realistic solution. We couldn't just do that as a society because of the economic and technological state that we have right now. And, like, what on earth would motivate parents to choose to do that?
Right.
How could millions of parents decide I am going to sit down and homeschool my kids? And then if they did, think of all the ones that would do it horribly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, for myself at least, like my homeschooling experience, I was pretty much self-taught. I mean, I went through the program, but I didn't really have a ton of help from
Mm,
my like mom. It's just it wasn't a bad thing necessarily. I was fine doing that, but
right.
it's just like it looks very, very different for each person.
Yes. Yes. And I don't think I've never seen anyone pose any kind of large scale societal solution to this problem. And I don't have one,
Right.
right? Um, but I do know what I can do for my future family, which is choose to homeschool and choose to not be a lazy homeschool parent in that process and choose to not make mistakes like sheltering my kids so much that they don't even have friends or um, failing to help my kids enjoy learning or failing to do the story thing. Like, I know that I can strive to eliminate all those problems from the jurisdiction that I'm given. And that's ultimately the mindset that I try to have towards this problem. And for me, going forward, I think that means how am I going to look at the problems that things like the problems that my family as a homeschool family faced in the past and the problems that my future homeschool family that I'm going to be the father of could have, rather than sitting around and criticizing societal problems.
Right.
But I do think there is a place for criticizing the societal problems because if everyone is just completely like unaware of them, that's a whole problem in and of itself.
Right. But it's really important to be constructive rather than deconstructive. It's okay to point out critical errors and flaws in a system, but it's really, I think, crucial to at least be working towards and to frame it in the light of finding a better way
Mm,
and
I
not
agree.
just tearing it down, right?
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I see people in this homeschooled culture that I'm a part of going, oh, public school is so evil.
Mm,
And I see myself as a middle school, oh my gosh. And I see myself as a middle school aged fellow looking at my public school peers as somehow less than me just because they're a part of a worse system than what I grew up in, right?
mm,
And obviously, those attitudes are wrong
yeah.
because they are deconstructive and they are prideful.
Mm, yeah.
Um, but none of that means that we should pretend, and I know you agree with this, none of that means that we should pretend as if the large scale and small scale problems don't exist.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah, we can't ignore reality because that is how we let ourselves and our society fall apart.
Hmm, exactly.
Yeah, and so I think it's just crucial to start with giving it more thought and just dwelling on it more. The concept of what is the best way that you learn, Ben? What is the best way that I learn? What is the best way that each of you listeners learn? And to think about how story interacts with that learning process, to think about how you learn through story, and even how you relationally grow with other people through stories you experience together, through stories you read, with your relationships with even reading about fictional people, and just seeing how that impacts you, and just being more conscious of that. And the first change in a system is through the culture. And so
Mm.
think about it that way. I don't think we have the power, no, neither you or me have the power to change the system right now, but we do have the power on a very minute level to start changing the culture. And I think you do too, listeners. Just think about it, talk about it, give it more thought, and enter the topic into conversations you have. And just whenever you approach a story, think, am I learning from this?
Mm. Yeah, that is really, really beautiful. And I think as we approach education and approach problems in education and approach solutions in education, what better way is there to think about it than story?